The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle, as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly through the corridors that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Unlike other children his age who might be rushing to breakfast or playing games, George moved with a thoughtful pace that seemed unusual for someone so young. His small footsteps echoed softly against the ancient stone floors, creating a gentle rhythm that had become familiar to the palace staff over the years. George had always been different from what people expected of a future king. While his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, had been known for her unwavering duty and formal demeanor, George possessed a gentleness that surprised everyone around him. His tutors often remarked on his unusual ability to listen carefully to others, regardless of their position or status within the palace hierarchy. Whether speaking with the Archbishop of Canterbury or the young kitchen assistant who brought his afternoon tea, George treated everyone with the same genuine respect and attention. On this particular morning, George noticed something that others might have overlooked. As he passed through the East Wing, he saw Mrs. Margaret Thompson, one of the senior housekeeping staff, sitting on a small wooden chair in an alcove, quietly wiping tears from her eyes. Margaret had worked at the palace for over 30 years, starting as a young woman fresh from the countryside. She had cleaned these very rooms when George's father was just a boy, and had watched 3 generations of royals grow up within these walls. George paused in his walk, his young mind processing what he was seeing. He had been taught proper royal protocol from an early age, understanding that there were appropriate ways for members of the royal family to interact with staff. However, something deeper than protocol stirred within him as he watched Margaret's shoulders shake with quiet sobs. Without hesitation, he approached her with the same natural kindness that had always defined his character. Margaret looked up in surprise when she noticed the young prince standing before her. She quickly tried to compose herself, standing and attempting a proper curtsy despite her emotional state. George gently gestured for her to remain seated, his young face showing genuine concern rather than the distant politeness often associated with royal interactions. Through her tears, Margaret explained that she had just received news that her grandson, Tommy, had been diagnosed with a serious illness. Tommy was the same age as George, and Margaret had often spoken fondly of him during her years of service. She had raised Tommy herself after his parents died in a car accident when he was just 3 years old. The doctors had told her that Tommy would need extensive treatment, and she was terrified about the costs and the time she would need to take off from work. George listened intently to every word, his young mind processing not just the facts of Margaret's situation, but the deep pain behind her words. He had grown up surrounded by privilege and comfort, but his parents had made sure he understood that not everyone lived the same way. They had taken him to visit hospitals and charities, teaching him about the responsibilities that would one day come with his position. However, this was the first time he was faced with such personal suffering from someone he saw every day. After Margaret finished speaking, George sat quietly for a moment, thinking carefully about what he had heard. Then, in a voice that was both gentle and determined, he told Margaret that he wanted to help. She smiled sadly and thanked him for his kindness, but explained that this was not something a young prince needed to worry about. She assured him that she would find a way to manage, just as she always had throughout her life's challenges. But George was not satisfied with simply offering words of comfort. That evening, he approached his father, Prince William, in his private study. William was reviewing documents related to his various charitable commitments when George knocked softly on the door. Father and son had always maintained a close relationship, with William making sure that despite the formal atmosphere of royal life, George felt comfortable coming to him with any concerns or questions. George explained Margaret's situation with the same careful attention to detail that he had learned from his royal education. He spoke about Tommy's illness, Margaret's fears about the medical costs, and her worry about taking time off from work. William listened with growing admiration for his son's compassion and maturity. When George finished explaining the situation, he made a request that surprised even his experienced father. George asked if there was a way for the royal family to help Tommy receive the best possible medical care without Margaret having to worry about the financial burden. He suggested that perhaps the family's connections with various hospitals and medical charities could be used to ensure Tommy received proper treatment. What struck William most deeply was not just George's desire to help, but the thoughtful way he had considered the practical aspects of the situation. William explained to George that while their desire to help was admirable, they needed to be careful about how they approached such situations. Royal assistance needed to be handled through proper channels to ensure that it was both effective and appropriate. However, he was moved by George's genuine concern and promised to look into what could be done. That night, as George lay in his bed surrounded by the luxury that had always been his normal world, he found himself thinking about Tommy, a boy his own age facing something so frightening and uncertain. He thought about Margaret, who had cleaned his room and brought him countless meals over the years, always with a warm smile and kind words. The contrast between his own secure world and their current struggle stayed with him as he finally drifted off to sleep. The next morning brought an unusual energy to the palace. Word had somehow spread among the staff about George's conversation with Margaret and his subsequent discussion with his father. While such personal matters were typically kept private, the genuine nature of George's concern had touched many people who had witnessed the interaction. The young prince had shown a level of empathy and practical thinking that seemed remarkable for someone his age. As George continued his morning routine, he was unaware that his simple act of stopping to listen to Margaret's troubles had set in motion a series of events that would soon affect everyone within the palace walls. His natural kindness, combined with his position and resources, was about to create ripples that would reach far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. 3 days had passed since George's conversation with his father about Margaret's situation, and the young prince found himself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of Tommy and the challenges the family was facing. Despite his youth, George had inherited a strong sense of responsibility that went beyond what was typically expected of someone his age. His parents had always encouraged him to think about others and to use his privileged position to make a positive difference in the world. During his morning lessons with his private tutor, Mr. Harrison, George found it difficult to concentrate on his mathematics problems. His mind kept wandering to Margaret, who he had seen looking increasingly worried each day as she went about her duties. Mr. Harrison, a perceptive man who had been teaching royal children for over 15 years, noticed George's distraction and gently inquired about what was troubling him. George explained the situation with characteristic thoughtfulness, describing not just the facts of Tommy's illness, but his own feelings of helplessness in the face of such a serious problem. Mr. Harrison listened carefully, impressed by George's mature approach to such a complex situation. He had taught many privileged children over the years, but rarely had he encountered someone so young who demonstrated such genuine concern for others outside their immediate family circle. After their lesson concluded, Mr. Harrison found himself reflecting on George's character and the potential impact the young prince might have as he grew older. That afternoon, he mentioned George's compassionate response to Margaret's situation during a casual conversation with other staff members in the palace break room. The story spread quietly through the palace community, with each person who heard it adding their own observations about George's consistent kindness toward everyone he encountered. Meanwhile, Prince William had been making discreet inquiries about Tommy's medical situation through his network of contacts in the healthcare community. As the future king and someone deeply involved in various charitable organizations, William had connections with some of the most respected pediatric specialists in the country. He learned that Tommy's condition, while serious, was treatable with the right medical intervention and that several specialized hospitals had programs designed to help families facing financial difficulties. When William shared this information with George during their evening walk through the palace gardens, the young prince's face lit up with hope and determination. George listened carefully as his father explained the various options available and the proper procedures that would need to be followed. However, George surprised William by suggesting that they should not just focus on Tommy's immediate medical needs, but also consider the broader impact on Margaret's work situation and emotional well-being. George proposed that Margaret should be given paid leave to care for Tommy during his treatment, and that the palace should ensure she felt no pressure to return to work until she was ready. Furthermore, he suggested that the family should maintain regular contact with Margaret during this difficult time. Not as employers checking on an employee, but as people who genuinely cared about her welfare. William was struck by the sophisticated understanding his son demonstrated regarding the human aspects of the situation. While George's suggestions were compassionate, they also showed a practical wisdom that seemed beyond his years. The young prince understood that effective help required more than just addressing the immediate problem. It required considering the dignity and emotional needs of the people involved. The following morning, Margaret was surprised to receive a request to meet with Prince William in his private office. As she walked through the familiar corridors toward the meeting, she felt a mixture of nervousness and curiosity about why she'd been summoned. Her 30 years of service had included many interactions with various members of the royal family. But such formal meetings were unusual. When Margaret entered the office, she was surprised to find George sitting beside his father, both of them rising to greet her with warm smiles. William began by expressing the family's awareness of her current situation and their desire to help in whatever way possible. He explained that arrangements had been made for Tommy to receive treatment at one of London's most prestigious children's hospitals, with all costs covered through a charitable fund that the royal family supported. As William continued outlining the arrangements that had been made, Margaret found herself overwhelmed by the generosity being offered. However, what moved her most deeply was not the financial assistance, but the genuine concern both father and son showed for her emotional well-being. George spoke directly to her, expressing his hope that she would not worry about her work responsibilities while Tommy was receiving treatment. He assured her that her position at the palace was secure and that everyone understood the importance of family during difficult times. Margaret struggled to find words adequate to express her gratitude. She had always known the royal family to be generous with their charitable giving, but this level of personal attention and care was beyond anything she had experienced. When she tried to thank them, George simply smiled and said that helping each other was what people should do, regardless of their positions or circumstances. Later that day, word of the royal family's intervention on Margaret's behalf spread throughout the palace community. The staff members who heard the story were impressed not just by the family's generosity, but by the mature compassion George had demonstrated throughout the situation. Many of them had worked in royal households for years and had witnessed various displays of charitable giving. But George's personal involvement and genuine emotional investment made this situation feel different. James Morrison, one of the senior royal guards who had protected the family for over a decade, found himself particularly moved by George's actions. James had served in the military before joining the Royal Protection Detail, and he had seen many examples of leadership under difficult circumstances. However, George's quiet determination to help Margaret and Tommy reminded him of the best qualities he had observed in military officers who truly cared about the welfare of their soldiers. That evening, as James walked his regular patrol route around the palace grounds, he reflected on the kind of king George might become if he continued to develop the empathy and practical wisdom he was already demonstrating. James had protected 3 generations of royals and had witnessed many pivotal moments in their development. He sensed that George's response to Margaret's crisis might be one of those defining moments that revealed the true character of a future leader. As the sun set over Windsor Castle, casting golden light across the ancient walls and manicured gardens, the palace felt different somehow. George's simple act of listening to Margaret's troubles and his determination to help had created a ripple effect that was touching everyone who worked within those historic walls. The young prince had shown that true leadership was not about commanding others, but about recognizing the humanity in everyone and using whatever resources were available to make their lives better. The story of George's intervention was quietly making its way beyond the palace walls as well. Margaret's sister, who worked at a local hospital, shared the story with her colleagues. Mr. Harrison mentioned it to other private tutors when they met for their monthly professional gathering. Each person who heard the story found themselves impressed by the young prince's maturity and genuine compassion. 2 weeks had passed since Tommy began his treatment at the specialized children's hospital in London, and the updates Margaret received from the medical team were encouraging. The doctors were optimistic about Tommy's response to the treatment, and Margaret felt a sense of hope that had been absent since the initial diagnosis. Each day she traveled from the palace to the hospital to be with her grandson, supported by the knowledge that her job was secure and that the royal family genuinely cared about her situation. George made it a point to check on Margaret's well-being whenever their paths crossed in the palace corridors. These brief conversations were always natural and unforced, with George asking about Tommy's progress and Margaret's own health during this stressful time. The young prince had a remarkable ability to remember small details from their previous conversations, asking about specific aspects of Tommy's treatment or particular concerns Margaret had mentioned. During one of these conversations, Margaret mentioned that Tommy had been asking about the palace where his grandmother worked. The young boy had always been fascinated by his grandmother's stories about the royal family and the historic building where she spent her days. Margaret explained that Tommy often wondered what it would be like to see the grand rooms and beautiful gardens he had heard so much about over the years. George listened to this information with his characteristic thoughtfulness, and that evening he approached his parents with an idea that surprised them with its creativity and compassion. He suggested that when Tommy was feeling well enough, perhaps he could visit the palace for a private tour. George explained that this might give Tommy something positive to look forward to during his treatment and recovery process. Prince William and Catherine discussed George's suggestion carefully, considering both the practical and security implications of such a visit. They were moved by their son's continued concern for Tommy's emotional well-being and his understanding that healing involved more than just medical treatment. After consulting with the appropriate security and protocol officials, they agreed that a carefully planned visit could be arranged once Tommy's doctors confirmed he was strong enough for such an outing. Meanwhile, the story of George's compassionate intervention in Margaret's situation had begun to resonate throughout the broader palace community in ways that no one had anticipated. Staff members who had worked at various royal residences for decades found themselves reflecting on their own experiences and the evolving nature of royal service. Many of them had witnessed significant changes in how the royal family interacted with their employees over the years, but George's actions seemed to represent something particularly meaningful. Captain Robert Sterling, the head of the Royal Guard unit responsible for palace security, had been observing these developments with professional interest and personal admiration. Captain Sterling had dedicated his career to protecting the royal family, rising through the ranks based on his exceptional skill and unwavering loyalty. He had served during times of celebration and crisis, always maintaining the highest standards of professional conduct and personal integrity. What struck Captain Sterling most profoundly about George's actions was not just the kindness shown to Margaret, but the young prince's apparent understanding of the broader implications of leadership and responsibility. In his years of service, Captain Sterling had protected royals who viewed their staff as necessary but distant employees, and others who recognized the human dignity of everyone who served the crown. George's actions suggested that he belonged firmly in the latter category, with an added dimension of personal engagement that seemed remarkable for someone so young. Captain Sterling found himself having conversations with other senior staff members about George's character and the potential implications for the future of the monarchy. These discussions were always conducted with appropriate discretion and respect, but they reflected a genuine excitement about the possibility of serving under a future king who demonstrated such authentic concern for others. One afternoon, as Captain Sterling was reviewing security protocols in his office, he received an unexpected visit from George himself. The young prince knocked politely on the door and asked if he might have a few minutes to discuss something important. Captain Sterling was surprised by this formal approach, as his interactions with George had typically been limited to security-related matters during official events. George entered the office with his usual quiet confidence and took a seat when Captain Sterling offered him a chair. The young prince began by expressing his appreciation for the dedication and professionalism of the entire security team. He mentioned specific instances where he had observed guards going above and beyond their basic duties to ensure the safety and comfort of his family and the palace staff. Then George surprised Captain Sterling by asking detailed questions about the daily experiences of the security personnel. He wanted to know about their working conditions, their concerns, and whether there were aspects of their service that could be improved. George explained that he had been thinking about the importance of understanding the perspectives of everyone who contributed to the smooth operation of the palace, and he wanted to learn more about the security team's experiences. Captain Sterling was impressed by the maturity and genuine interest George demonstrated during their conversation. The young prince asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to the responses, occasionally asking for clarification or expressing concern about particular challenges the security team faced. It became clear to Captain Sterling that George's concern for Margaret was not an isolated incident, but rather an expression of a broader philosophy about leadership and responsibility. During their discussion, George mentioned his plans for Tommy's visit to the palace and asked Captain Sterling about the security considerations involved. The young prince demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the need to balance compassion with appropriate safety measures. He suggested that the visit could be structured in a way that would minimize any security risks while still providing Tommy with a meaningful experience. Captain Sterling found himself deeply moved by George's approach to this situation. The young prince was not simply making demands or expecting others to handle the details of his charitable impulses. Instead, he was taking personal responsibility for understanding the complexities involved and ensuring that his desire to help did not create unnecessary difficulties for the security team or other staff members. After George left his office, Captain Sterling sat quietly for several minutes, reflecting on the conversation they had just shared. In his many years of service, he had protected royals during various stages of their development, but he had rarely encountered someone so young who demonstrated such a mature understanding of leadership responsibilities. George's combination of genuine compassion and practical wisdom suggested that he possessed the qualities necessary to become an exceptional king. That evening, Captain Sterling found himself discussing the conversation with his wife during their daily phone call. He explained, within the bounds of appropriate discretion, how impressed he had been with George's character and his thoughtful approach to helping others. Captain Sterling's wife, who had supported his royal service career for many years, was moved by her husband's obvious admiration for the young prince. As word of George's meeting with Captain Sterling spread quietly through the security team, the guards found themselves reflecting on their own service and their relationship with the royal family they protected. Many of them had chosen their careers based on a sense of duty and loyalty to the crown. But George's personal interest in their welfare added a new dimension to their motivation. The palace atmosphere continued to evolve as more people became aware of George's consistent demonstration of empathy and practical concern for others. Staff members who had worked there for decades remarked that there was something different about the way people interacted with each other, as if George's example was inspiring everyone to consider the humanity and dignity of their colleagues more carefully. The day of Tommy's visit to the palace arrived with an unusual sense of anticipation among the staff. Margaret had received confirmation from Tommy's medical team that he was strong enough for the outing, and his excitement about seeing his grandmother's workplace had been a bright spot during his recovery process. George had personally overseen many of the arrangements for the visit, working closely with Captain Sterling and other staff members to ensure that everything would be perfect for their young guest. Tommy arrived at the palace accompanied by Margaret and a nurse from the hospital who would monitor his condition throughout the visit. Despite the effects of his ongoing treatment, Tommy's eyes shone with wonder as he walked through the same corridors his grandmother had described to him countless times over the years. George met them at the entrance, greeting Tommy with the same natural warmth he had shown Margaret during their difficult time. The tour George had planned was carefully structured to accommodate Tommy's energy levels while showing him the most impressive aspects of the palace. They began in the state dining room, where George explained some of the history behind the magnificent paintings and furnishings. Tommy listened with rapt attention, asking questions that demonstrated both his intelligence and his genuine interest in what he was seeing. As they moved through the various rooms, George made sure to include Margaret in all of his explanations, acknowledging her years of service and her intimate knowledge of the palace's daily operations. He spoke about Margaret with obvious respect and affection, describing her as someone who had helped make the palace a true home for his family. Tommy beamed with pride as he listened to George speak about his grandmother's important contributions to royal life. When they reached the palace gardens, Tommy's energy seemed to revive as he breathed the fresh air and marveled at the carefully maintained landscapes. George had arranged for them to have tea in a small pavilion overlooking the rose garden, and he had personally selected some of his favorite books and games to share with Tommy during their break. The two boys, despite the significant differences in their circumstances, found common ground in their shared interests and natural curiosity about the world. During their tea, Tommy mentioned that he wanted to become a doctor when he grew up, inspired by the kindness and skill of the medical team treating him. George listened with genuine interest as Tommy described his observations about the hospital and his desire to help other children facing similar challenges. The conversation revealed Tommy's mature perspective on his own situation and his determination to use his experience to benefit others in the future. George was struck by the parallels between Tommy's response to his illness and his own growing understanding of how to use privilege and position to help others. Both boys, in their different ways, were learning about responsibility and the importance of considering the welfare of people beyond their immediate families. Their conversation deepened. George's appreciation for Tommy's courage and strengthened his own commitment to using his future role as king to make a positive difference in people's lives. As the visit continued, Captain Sterling and his security team observed the interaction between the two boys with professional interest and personal admiration. They watched as George demonstrated natural leadership skills while ensuring that Tommy felt comfortable and valued throughout the tour. The young prince's ability to balance his royal status with genuine friendship impressed everyone who witnessed their interaction. The highlight of Tommy's visit came when George took him to see the horses in the royal stables. Tommy had mentioned his love of animals during their tea conversation, and George had arranged for them to meet some of the gentler horses used for ceremonial occasions. Under the careful supervision of the royal grooms, both boys were able to feed and pet the horses, creating a moment of pure joy that seemed to energize Tommy despite his ongoing medical treatment. Margaret watched the entire visit with tears of gratitude and pride. Seeing her grandson's happiness and witnessing George's continued kindness reinforced her deep appreciation for the royal family's support during this difficult time. She was particularly moved by George's natural ability to treat Tommy as an equal, never showing any condescension or awkwardness despite their very different backgrounds and circumstances. As the visit concluded, Tommy presented George with a small drawing he had made during his time in the hospital. The picture showed two boys playing together in a garden, and Tommy explained that it represented his memory of their day together at the palace. George accepted the gift with obvious pleasure, promising to display it in his room and to remember their friendship always. The impact of Tommy's visit extended far beyond the immediate participants. Staff members throughout the palace had been aware of the special guest and had witnessed various moments of the tour as George and Tommy moved through different areas. The sight of their young prince taking such personal care to ensure Tommy's happiness and comfort reinforced their growing admiration for George's character. That evening, Captain Sterling found himself reflecting on the day's events during his final security rounds. He had observed many official visits and ceremonial occasions during his years of service, but there had been something uniquely moving about watching George's genuine friendship with Tommy. The young prince had demonstrated qualities of leadership that went beyond protocol and ceremony to encompass genuine human connection and empathy. In the days following Tommy's visit, the story of George's kindness continued to resonate throughout the palace community. Staff members who had witnessed the visit shared their observations with colleagues, describing George's natural warmth and his obvious concern for Tommy's well-being. The consensus among everyone who had been involved was that they had witnessed something special, a demonstration of the kind of leadership that could inspire genuine loyalty and devotion. The visit had also strengthened the bond between George and Margaret, who now saw each other not just as prince and palace employee, but as people who shared a concern for Tommy's welfare and a mutual respect for each other's character. Margaret continued to provide updates about Tommy's progress, and George maintained his interest in the boys' recovery and future plans. Word of George's compassionate actions had begun to spread beyond the palace walls, through the discreet conversations of staff members with their families and friends. The story of the young prince who had noticed a staff member's distress and had taken personal action to help resonated with people who heard it, creating a growing sense of optimism about the future of the monarchy. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, Tommy's primary physician at the Children's Hospital, had been impressed by the positive impact Tommy's palace visit had on his spirits and overall well-being. She had observed that patients who had positive experiences and supportive relationships often showed better responses to treatment. Tommy's excitement about his friendship with George and his renewed enthusiasm for his recovery had been notable factors in his continued improvement. The medical team's observations about Tommy's progress were shared with Margaret during her regular updates, and she passed this positive news along to George during one of their corridor conversations. George was delighted to learn that Tommy was responding well to treatment and that the palace visit might have contributed to his improved spirits. This feedback reinforced George's understanding of the complex connections between emotional well-being and physical health. Several weeks had passed since Tommy's memorable visit to the palace, and his medical treatment was progressing better than anyone had dared to hope. The doctors reported that he was responding exceptionally well to the therapy, and there was growing optimism about his complete recovery. Margaret's daily visits to the hospital had become routine, supported by the knowledge that her position at the palace remained secure, and that she had the genuine concern of the royal family during this challenging time. George continued to follow Tommy's progress with keen interest, asking Margaret for updates whenever they encountered each other during her work at the palace. These conversations had evolved beyond simple inquiries about medical progress to include discussions about Tommy's schoolwork, his interests, and his dreams for the future. George had developed a genuine friendship with the boy that transcended their initial meeting, and he often found himself thinking about ways to continue supporting Tommy's education and development. During one of their conversations, Margaret mentioned that Tommy had been working on a school project about British history and the monarchy. Despite his medical treatment, Tommy had maintained his academic interest with the help of hospital tutors who ensured he did not fall behind in his studies. Margaret explained that Tommy was particularly interested in learning about how the monarchy had evolved over time and how modern royals approached their responsibilities to the British people. George was intrigued by Tommy's academic interests and asked Margaret if Tommy might like to correspond with him about his history project. The young prince explained that he had access to historical documents and resources that might be helpful for Tommy's research, and he genuinely enjoyed discussing history and the role of the monarchy in modern society. Margaret was touched by George's continued interest in her grandson's education and promised to ask Tommy about the possibility of such correspondence. When Margaret shared George's offer with Tommy during her next hospital visit, the boy's face lit up with excitement. The prospect of having Prince George as a pen pal for his history project seemed almost too wonderful to believe. Tommy immediately began preparing thoughtful questions about royal history and the responsibilities of future kings, demonstrating the same intellectual curiosity that had impressed his doctors and teachers throughout his treatment. The correspondence between George and Tommy began with a formal letter from the young prince, congratulating Tommy on his academic dedication, despite his medical challenges. George shared some historical facts about Windsor Castle and included photographs of some of the historical documents and artifacts housed in the royal collection. He encouraged Tommy to ask specific questions about any aspects of royal history that particularly interested him. Tommy's response letter revealed his sophisticated understanding of British history and his genuine curiosity about the evolution of royal responsibilities. He asked thoughtful questions about how George was being prepared for his future role as king and what aspects of royal duty George found most interesting or challenging. The correspondence quickly developed into a genuine intellectual exchange that impressed both boys' tutors and families. As their letter exchange continued, George found himself gaining new insights into his own role and responsibilities through Tommy's perceptive questions. The young boy's perspective as someone outside the royal bubble helped George think more clearly about the relevance and importance of the monarchy in contemporary British society. Tommy's questions challenged George to articulate his own understanding of royal duty and to consider how he might use his future position to make meaningful contributions to the country. Captain Sterling had been observing the development of George and Tommy's friendship with professional interest and personal admiration. The correspondence between the two boys had become a regular part of palace life, with George carefully crafting his letters and eagerly awaiting Tommy's responses. Captain Sterling was struck by how this relationship seemed to be deepening George's understanding of leadership and his connection to the broader British public. During one of their regular security briefings, George asked Captain Sterling about his own background and what had motivated him to pursue a career in Royal Protection Service. The young prince explained that his correspondence with Tommy had made him more curious about the different paths people took in service to their country, whether in the military, public service, or other forms of civic contribution. Captain Sterling was moved by George's genuine interest in his career and personal motivations. He shared his own story of growing up in a working-class family and his decision to join the military as a way of serving his country. He explained how his military experience had prepared him for his current role, protecting the royal family, and how he viewed his service as part of his ongoing commitment to British society. George listened intently to Captain Sterling's story, asking thoughtful questions about military service and the different ways people contributed to the common good. The conversation revealed George's growing understanding that effective leadership required appreciation for all forms of service and sacrifice, whether from military personnel, civil servants, healthcare workers, or palace staff like Margaret. The deepening relationship between George and Captain Sterling did not go unnoticed by other members of the security team. They observed their captain's obvious respect and admiration for the young prince, and many of them began to share Captain Sterling's optimism about George's potential as a future king. The security team had protected many royals over the years, but there was something special about George's combination of genuine curiosity, natural compassion, and growing sense of responsibility. Meanwhile, Tommy's recovery continued to progress ahead of schedule, and the medical team began discussing plans for his return to normal activities, including regular school attendance. Margaret was overwhelmed with gratitude for the positive turn in her grandson's health and the support system that had made his recovery possible. She frequently expressed her appreciation to George for his role in securing Tommy's medical care and for his continued friendship with her grandson. As Tommy's discharge from the hospital approached, George began planning a special celebration to mark this milestone. He worked with palace staff to organize a small gathering that would include Margaret, Tommy, and several of the people who had been involved in supporting them throughout this difficult period. George wanted to ensure that Tommy's recovery was properly celebrated and that everyone who had contributed to his care felt appreciated for their efforts. The planning for Tommy's celebration gave George an opportunity to work closely with various palace departments, from catering to security to protocol. He approached each interaction with the same thoughtful consideration he had shown throughout the entire situation, ensuring that everyone involved understood the importance of making the event special for Tommy while maintaining appropriate security and protocol standards. Captain Sterling was particularly impressed by George's approach to organizing the celebration. The young prince demonstrated sophisticated project management skills and a natural ability to coordinate with different departments while maintaining a clear focus on the human element of the event. George's leadership style seemed to bring out the best in everyone involved, inspiring them to go above and beyond their normal duties to ensure Tommy's celebration would be memorable. As the date for the celebration approached, word of the event spread throughout the palace community, generating excitement and anticipation among staff members who had followed Tommy's story from the beginning. Many of them had been moved by George's compassionate response to Margaret's crisis and his sustained commitment to Tommy's welfare. The upcoming celebration felt like a fitting culmination of a story that had touched everyone who had been involved. The security team, in particular, found themselves reflecting on their service and their relationship with the royal family they protected. George's example of leadership through service and genuine concern for others had created a new standard of excellence that inspired them to approach their duties with renewed dedication and purpose. Captain Sterling sensed that something fundamental had changed in the palace atmosphere, creating a stronger sense of shared mission and mutual respect among all who served there. The day of Tommy's celebration arrived with perfect spring weather, as if nature itself was acknowledging the significance of the occasion. The small gathering George had organized was to take place in the same garden pavilion where he and Tommy had shared tea during the boys' palace visit weeks earlier. The setting held special meaning for both boys, representing the beginning of their unlikely but meaningful friendship. George had personally overseen every detail of the celebration, From the selection of Tommy's favorite foods to the inclusion of a small display featuring Tommy's correspondence and artwork from his hospital stay, the young prince wanted the event to honor not just Tommy's recovery, but also his courage, intelligence, and positive spirit throughout his medical treatment. George understood that celebrating others' achievements was an important aspect of leadership and community building. Margaret arrived early to help with final preparations, accompanied by Tommy, who was visibly excited about returning to the palace for this special occasion. The boy looked healthy and energetic, a dramatic contrast to his condition during those frightening early days of his diagnosis. His improvement was a testament to excellent medical care, family support, and perhaps most importantly, the hope and positive relationships that had sustained him throughout his recovery. As guests began to arrive for the celebration, George made sure to personally greet each person and express his appreciation for their role in Tommy's support system. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, Tommy's primary physician, attended along with several nurses who had provided his care. Captain Sterling and other key palace staff members were also present, representing the community that had rallied around Margaret and Tommy during their time of need. Prince William and Catherine joined the celebration, bringing their own warmth and genuine interest in Tommy's recovery. They had followed their son's involvement in the situation from the beginning and were impressed by George's sustained commitment to helping the family. Their presence at the celebration demonstrated the entire royal family's support for George's compassionate approach to leadership and service. The highlight of the celebration came when George presented Tommy with a special gift he had been working on with the palace historians. It was a beautifully bound collection of historical documents and photographs related to Tommy's history project, along with a personal letter from George reflecting on their friendship and correspondence. The gift represented George's understanding that education and intellectual curiosity were gifts that would serve Tommy throughout his life. Tommy's response to George's gift was both touching and mature. He thanked the prince not just for the historical materials, but for the friendship and support that had meant so much to him during his treatment. Tommy spoke about how George's letters had given him something positive to focus on during difficult days and how their correspondence had inspired his continued interest in history and public service. During the celebration, Dr. Chen took the opportunity to speak with George about the positive impact his friendship had on Tommy's recovery process. She explained that patients who maintained strong social connections and had positive experiences often showed better treatment outcomes. Tommy's excitement about his correspondence with George and his anticipation of future interactions had been significant factors in his psychological well-being throughout his medical care. Captain Sterling found himself deeply moved by the celebration and by George's obvious joy in Tommy's recovery. The young prince's sustained commitment to helping Margaret's family had demonstrated qualities of character that went far beyond what might be expected from someone his age. Captain Sterling reflected on the many royals he had protected over the years and recognized that George possessed something special, a natural ability to inspire others through genuine care and consistent action. As the celebration continued, Tommy shared some of his artwork and writing from his hospital stay, including pieces inspired by his correspondence with George and his visits to the palace. His creative work revealed a sophisticated understanding of themes like courage, friendship, and service that impressed all the adults present. Tommy's intellectual and emotional maturity had clearly been strengthened by his challenging experiences and the supportive relationships he had developed. George listened carefully to Tommy's presentations, asking thoughtful questions and offering encouraging comments that demonstrated his genuine interest in his friend's creative development. The interaction between the two boys continued to impress everyone present, showing how authentic friendship could transcend differences in background and circumstances. Their relationship had become a model of how privilege could be used to build meaningful connections rather than create barriers. During a quiet moment in the celebration, Margaret approached George to express her gratitude once again for everything he had done for her family. She spoke about how his initial act of simply listening to her troubles had set in motion a chain of events that had not only saved Tommy's life but had also restored her faith in the fundamental goodness of people. Margaret's words carried the weight of genuine experience and deep appreciation. George's response to Margaret's thanks revealed his continued humility and his evolving understanding of leadership. He explained that helping Tommy had taught him important lessons about the responsibilities that came with his position and the importance of paying attention to the needs of others. George acknowledged that he had learned as much from the experience as he had given, demonstrating the wisdom that would serve him well in his future role. As the celebration began to wind down, Captain Sterling made an announcement that surprised everyone present. He requested a moment to address the group and began by speaking about his many years of service protecting the royal family. He described how he had witnessed various examples of royal leadership and public service, but had rarely seen anything as inspiring as George's sustained commitment to helping. Margaret and Tommy, Captain Sterling continued by explaining that George's actions had reminded him why he had chosen a career in royal service and had renewed his dedication to protecting a family that demonstrated such genuine care for their subjects. He spoke about the honor of serving someone who understood that true leadership meant using privilege and position to lift others up rather than to create distance or superiority. Then Captain Sterling made an announcement that stunned everyone present. He explained that George's example had so deeply moved him that he wanted to make a gesture of respect and admiration. He announced that he was formally requesting a transfer to a different position within royal service, not because he was dissatisfied with his current role, but because he wanted to serve in a capacity that would allow him to support George more directly as the young prince continued to develop his leadership skills. The announcement created a moment of profound silence as everyone processed the significance of Captain Sterling's words. For a senior member of the Royal Protection Team to request a transfer based on his admiration for a young prince was unprecedented. The gesture demonstrated the depth of impact George's actions had on everyone who witnessed them. George himself was visibly moved by Captain Sterling's announcement and asked to speak with him privately. The two stepped aside for a brief conversation during which George expressed his appreciation for Captain Sterling's service and his surprise at such a significant gesture. George asked Captain Sterling to reconsider his decision, explaining that his current role was important and that George valued his continued protection of the family. Captain Sterling's response revealed the depth of his feelings about George's character and potential. He explained that protecting George was indeed important, but that he believed the young prince represented something special for the future of the monarchy. He wanted to be part of supporting that future in whatever way would be most beneficial, even if it meant changing his own career path. The exchange between George and Captain Sterling was observed by the other guests, who recognized that they were witnessing something historically significant. The level of respect and admiration Captain Sterling showed for the young prince reflected the broader impact George's actions had on everyone who had been involved in supporting Margaret and Tommy. The weeks following Tommy's celebration brought an unexpected development that would resonate throughout the royal household and beyond. Captain Sterling's announcement about requesting a transfer had created ripples of discussion among the palace staff, but what happened next surprised everyone, including Captain Sterling himself. Rather than simply processing his transfer request, the royal administration began receiving similar requests from other members of the security team and palace staff. The pattern that emerged was remarkable and unprecedented in the history of royal service. Guard after guard, staff member after staff member, approached their supervisors with similar requests to be reassigned to positions that would allow them to serve George more directly. Each person who made such a request cited the young prince's character, his compassionate leadership, and their desire to be part of supporting his development as a future king. Sergeant Michael Davies, who had served in royal protection for 8 years, was among the first to follow Captain Sterling's example. He explained to his supervisors that witnessing George's sustained commitment to helping Margaret and Tommy had reminded him of why he had originally chosen royal service. Sergeant Davies spoke about his desire to be part of an organization that embodied the values of service and compassion that George had demonstrated. So, naturally, the phenomenon continued to spread as more staff members learned about the transfer requests. Maria Santos, a palace administrator who had worked in various royal residences for over a decade, submitted her own request to be assigned to George's household staff. She explained that the young prince's approach to leadership represented everything she had hoped to see in the monarchy, and she wanted to contribute to his continued development in whatever way possible. The accumulation of these requests created an unprecedented situation for the royal administration. Never before had so many experienced staff members simultaneously requested transfers based on their admiration for a single member of the royal family. The requests came from people across all departments and levels of service, from senior security personnel to junior administrative staff, all united by their respect for George's character and leadership potential. Prince William and Catherine found themselves in the unique position of managing a situation that was both deeply flattering and practically challenging. While they were proud of their son's positive impact on the palace community, they also recognized that the mass transfer requests could create operational difficulties. They needed to find a way to honor the genuine feelings behind the requests while maintaining the smooth functioning of all royal households. George himself was deeply moved but also somewhat overwhelmed by the scale of the response to his actions. He had never intended for his simple gesture of helping Margaret to create such a significant reaction among the palace staff. The young prince found himself reflecting on the responsibility that came with the obvious influence he had on others and the importance of using that influence wisely. During a family discussion about how to handle the situation, George surprised his parents with his thoughtful analysis of what was happening. He explained that while he was honored by the staff's desire to serve him directly, he believed that excellent service to the royal family as a whole was more important than individual assignments. George suggested that the focus should be on creating an environment where all staff members felt valued and respected, regardless of which royal they served directly. George's mature response to the situation impressed his parents and reinforced their confidence in his developing judgment. The young prince proposed that instead of simply reassigning staff members, the family should use this opportunity to strengthen the overall culture of service within all royal households. He suggested implementing regular meetings where staff could share ideas about improving their service and creating stronger connections between different departments. The implementation of George's suggestions began with a series of meetings that brought together staff members from various royal residences. These gatherings provided opportunities for people to discuss their motivations for royal service and to share their observations about effective leadership and meaningful work. The meetings revealed a deep commitment to service among the staff and a genuine excitement about contributing to the monarchy's positive impact on British society. Captain Sterling found himself playing a key role in these discussions, sharing his perspective on how George's leadership style had inspired him and others to think differently about their service. He spoke about the importance of protecting not just the physical safety of the royal family, but also supporting their ability to serve the British people effectively. Captain Sterling's insights helped other staff members articulate their own feelings about the value and purpose of their work. The staff meetings also provided an opportunity for George to interact directly with employees from across the royal household system. He attended several of the gatherings, listening carefully to people's perspectives and asking thoughtful questions about their experiences and suggestions for improvement. These interactions further demonstrated George's genuine interest in understanding and supporting the people who contributed to royal operations. During one particularly memorable meeting, Margaret spoke about her experience receiving help from the royal family during Tommy's illness. She described how George's initial act of simply listening to her troubles had led to comprehensive support that had saved her grandson's life. Margaret's testimony provided a powerful example of how royal compassion could translate into meaningful action that changed people's lives. Tommy himself attended one of the meetings, sharing his perspective as someone who had benefited from the royal family's support and kindness. He spoke about how George's friendship had helped him maintain hope during his medical treatment, and how their correspondence had inspired his continued interest in public service. Tommy's words carried special weight because they came from someone outside the royal system who had experienced its positive impact firsthand. The outcome of these discussions was a series of reforms that strengthened the entire royal household system. New communication channels were established to ensure that staff concerns and suggestions reached appropriate decision-makers. Regular recognition programs were implemented to acknowledge exceptional service across all departments. Professional development opportunities were expanded to help staff members grow in their careers, while contributing more effectively to royal operations. Most significantly, George's role within the royal household began to evolve in ways that reflected both his growing maturity and the staff's desire to support his development. He was given increased responsibilities for coordinating charitable activities and staff welfare initiatives, providing him with practical experience in leadership while allowing him to continue demonstrating the compassion that had inspired so many people. The changes implemented throughout the royal household system began to attract positive attention beyond the palace walls. Stories about improved working conditions and innovative approaches to royal service appeared in various publications, contributing to a broader perception that the monarchy was evolving in positive directions under the influence of the younger generation. Captain Sterling's original request for transfer was ultimately modified into a new role that allowed him to work closely with George while maintaining his security responsibilities. This solution satisfied his desire to support the young prince's development while preserving his valuable experience and skills in royal protection. The creative approach to Captain Sterling's situation became a model for addressing other staff requests in ways that honored their motivations while maintaining operational effectiveness. As the dust settled from this remarkable period of change, the royal household had been transformed in ways that reflected George's values and leadership style. The young prince had demonstrated that true leadership involved inspiring others to be their best selves while working together toward common goals. His simple act of helping Margaret during her time of need had created a ripple effect that touched every aspect of royal operations and established new standards of excellence in service and compassion. The story of George's quiet gesture and its extraordinary consequences became part of palace folklore, shared among staff members as an example of how individual actions could create positive change on a much larger scale. The young prince had shown that effective leadership was not about commanding obedience, but about inspiring others through authentic care and consistent demonstration of values.